Estille Clarke sat in the back of a black Audi she hadn't chosen to get into, watching streetlights smear gold across the wet glass, and thought, absurdly, that she should have brought her sketchbook. It was the kind of thought that arrives when the real thought is too large to hold. The real thought was, my stepfather just sold me. Not in those words, of course. Derek hadn't said sold. He'd said arrangement. He'd said this solves everything, love, you'll see. He'd said it while not looking at her, which told her more than any word could. The man in the front passenger seat hadn't spoken since the flat. Neither had the driver. They were large in the unbothered way of men who had never needed to prove it, and their silence filled the car more completely than conversation would have. Estille pressed her ink-stained fingers flat against her thigh, an old habit, feeling for the ghost of a pencil that wasn't there. Fight, run, or survive. She turned the choices over like stones in a pocket. There had been no moment to fight. There had been no door to run through. That left the third thing, the thing she'd been doing quietly for 6 years now, ever since her mother's hospital bed and Derek's slow, patient dismantling of every safety she'd had left. The car turned into an underground garage beneath a building so tall its top floors dissolved into the rain fog above. Concrete, halogen light, the distant drip of water from somewhere unseen. The driver opened her door. She stepped out because staying seated would have accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable, and Estille Clarke had never seen the point in delaying inevitable things. Better to look them in the face. The lift took them up in a silence so complete she could hear her own pulse. When the doors opened, she was standing in a hallway of pale stone and low gold light, and at the end of it, a man was waiting. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested violence held in reserve rather than violence used carelessly, dressed in black that fit him like a decision rather than a purchase. His hair was dark, short, precise. His eyes, when they found hers, were the color of wet stone in November light, and they did not move away, and they did not need to raise themselves to make her understand, immediately, completely, that she was standing in front of the only person in this building whose permission actually mattered. You are the payment, he said. Not a question. His voice was quiet. Quiet the way a held breath is quiet. Estille Clarke, 22 years old, orphaned twice over, 6 years practiced in swallowing fear until it turned into something usable, lifted her chin very slightly and did not look away. She did not know yet that this man, this cold, watching, terrifyingly still man they called the Black Lotus in every rain-slicked corner of the London underworld, was about to become the only wall between her and a world that had never once protected her. She only knew that from tonight, nothing about her life would belong to her old world again. She was about to become untouchable. Quick one before we go on, where are you watching from tonight? Drop it below. And here's the question I want you sitting with. If your own family sold you to clear their debts, what would you actually do? Fight? Run? Or survive by any means necessary? Keep that answer in your pocket. You're going to need it. Estille's father died when she was 11 on a Tuesday, of a heart that had apparently been quietly failing for years without telling anyone, least of all him. She remembered the day less as a single scene and more as a texture, the particular gray of the light in the kitchen that morning, the smell of toast going cold and untouched, her mother's hand gripping the phone so hard her knuckles had gone the color of bone. Her mother lasted 4 more years. Not well. Grief did something to Margaret Clarke that the doctors couldn't quite name and didn't particularly try to. It simply hollowed her, slowly, the way water hollows stone, until the diagnosis that finally came, ovarian cancer, stage 3 by the time anyone looked properly, felt less like new information and more like a formality. Estille was 15 when she buried her mother beside her father in a cemetery in Bow, and 16 when Derek Hale, her mother's second husband of barely 2 years, stopped pretending that grief was something he intended to share the weight of. Derek was not cruel in the way that leaves marks. He was cruel in the accumulating way, the way a house grows cold not because someone opens a window but because no one ever quite gets around to closing it. He forgot to buy her school things. He forgot her birthday twice. He let his own children, Kelsey and Ryan, 17 and 19 when their stepmother died, entrenched and entitled and coldly certain that the flat and everything in it belonged to their family, not the ghost of a woman who'd married their father and then had the poor manners to die, treat the flat as though Estille were furniture that occasionally needed feeding. She learned to make herself small in useful ways. She learned which stairs creaked. She learned to eat what was left rather than what she wanted. She learned, on the good nights, to sit by her window with a stub of pencil and a sketchbook she bought with birthday money from an aunt who eventually stopped visiting, and to draw the rooftops of East London in the blue-grey hour before the streetlights switched off, chimneys like crooked teeth, pigeons hunched against the cold, the particular way morning light hit wet slate. It was the only thing in those years that felt entirely hers. Derek's debts began the way most disasters begin, quietly and to someone else. A bad investment. A worse loan to cover it. A worse loan again from men who did not send polite letters when payments were missed. By the time Estille was 20, the debt had a texture of its own in the flat, present in every slammed door, every hushed phone call Derek took on the landing, every time Kelsey's mouth went thin and mean when money was mentioned. She tried to leave twice. The first time at 19 she'd saved £400 from a bakery job and gotten as far as a bedsit in Leighton before Derek turned up, sober and terrified in a way she'd never seen him, begging her to come back, telling her the men he owed had started asking questions about family, about what family was worth if debts weren't. She'd gone back because she was young enough to still believe that fear from an adult meant something was being protected, rather than someone. The second time at 21 she made it 3 weeks with a friend from college before the friend's mother, gently but firmly, explained that housing a runaway wasn't something she could keep doing, not with what Derek's associates had apparently started implying on the phone. She stopped trying after that. Not because she'd given up. Estille Clarke did not, as a rule, give up, not entirely, not all the way down, but because she'd started to understand, with the particular clarity of someone who has run out of other people to lean on, that whatever was coming she would have to meet it on her feet rather than mid-flight. It came on a Thursday. She remembered the kitchen table with unnatural precision afterward, the water ring from a glass no one had wiped up in months, the fluorescent light overhead that buzzed faintly and had done for years, Derek's hands flat on the table like a man bracing for a blow he'd arranged for himself. Kelsey stood by the counter with her arms crossed, not meeting Estille's eyes. Ryan wasn't there at all. He'd made himself scarce, which told her everything about how much he already knew. "There's a man," Derek said. "Coming tonight. Estille, it's an arrangement. It solves everything. You'll see." "What kind of arrangement?" Her voice came out flatter than she expected. Some part of her had already known, had known for weeks in the way you know a storm is coming from the particular stillness of the air. "A good one. A safe one. He's a serious man, a respected man, and he's willing to clear everything, Estille, the whole debt, if—" Derek's voice cracked slightly, and for one disorienting second she almost felt sorry for him, before the feeling curdled into something closer to disgust. "If you go with him tonight." The silence that followed had weight. Estille looked at her stepsister, who still would not look back. She looked at Derek, whose eyes were wet and useless, a man who had spent 6 years failing to protect a dead woman's daughter and was now, in the final accounting, actively spending her to protect himself. "You're selling me," she said. Not a question either. She was becoming fluent, tonight, in statements that didn't need answers. "It's not," Derek started and stopped because there was no honest way to finish that sentence, and even he seemed to know it. She did not cry. She had learned, over 6 years of small erosions, that crying in this flat accomplished nothing except giving Kelsey something to roll her eyes about. Instead she went to her room for one more hour, and sat on the edge of the bed with her sketchbook in her lap, not drawing, just holding it, feeling the familiar weight of it like a hand on her shoulder. Outside, the rain had started, fine and gray, tapping the window in a rhythm that felt almost like company. The stranger arrived at 8. He didn't come up. 2 men came up instead, quiet, competent, unbothered by Derek's stammering explanations, and one of them looked at her. Really looked, assessing, professional, entirely without malice, which was somehow worse than if he'd sneered, and said, "Miss Clarke. The car's downstairs." She took nothing with her but the sketchbook and the coat on her back. At the door, Derek said her name once like it might mean something. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough to memorize the particular cowardice in his face, so she'd never again mistake it for grief, and then she walked out without answering. The car pulled away from the curb into the rain, past the corner shop where she'd bought milk 1,000 times, past the bus stop where she used to sketch commuters' tired faces under the orange light, past the whole small, gray, hard-won geography of the only home she'd ever fully known. She watched it recede in the wing mirror until the rain smeared it into nothing, and she thought, clear-eyed, dry-eyed, already rebuilding herself around the wound the way she'd learned to do at 11, and again at 15. "So this is what I'm worth to them. Now let's see what I'm worth to myself." The underground garage smelled of rain and concrete and, faintly, of expensive cologne that had lingered from someone else's car. Estille catalogued it the way she catalogued everything now, out of old habit. Doorways, exits, the number of men, the weight of the silence. Because noticing was the only power she had left, and she intended to keep every scrap of it. The private lift rose without a sound. No numbers lit above the door. Wherever they were going wasn't meant to be counted. When it opened, the hallway beyond was pale stone, warm gold light, a hush so total it felt architectural, deliberate, built to remind anyone standing in it how far they were from anywhere ordinary. And then the man. She had expected, in the small numb part of her mind that had been quietly preparing for the worst all evening, someone loud. Someone who wanted to be feared and worked visibly at it, gold chains, raised voices, the theater of cruelty. What she got instead was a stillness so complete it made the hair on her arms rise. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides, black suit without a single wrinkle, and when he looked at her it wasn't with hunger or menace but with something closer to assessment, the way you might look at a ledger to see if the numbers added up. "You are the payment," he said. "I got that impression," she said before she could stop herself, and immediately catalogued that too, the tiny flicker at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, gone before it fully arrived. "Bitgaram," he said as though offering his name were a kind of concession. "You'll come with me." She followed because the alternative, refusing in a stone hallway 30 floors above London with 2 large men behind her, wasn't a real alternative at all, and Estille had never wasted energy on gestures that changed nothing. The suite he led her to was enormous, softly lit, all pale wood and dark glass and a wall of windows that looked out over rain-blurred rooftops she might in another life have wanted to draw. He gestured for her to sit. She didn't, not immediately, and something in the set of his shoulders suggested he'd noted that too, filed it away. "3 rules," he said, when she'd finally lowered herself onto the edge of a chair that cost more than Derek's entire flat. "You will not attempt to leave this building without my knowledge. You will not contact your former family. And you will not lie to me. Everything else is negotiable." "Negotiable," she repeated. "That's generous for a man who just bought me." "I did not buy you." His voice didn't rise, it never would, she'd learned, not for years. "I bought a debt. What Derek Hale sold was never his to sell. What I choose to do with that mistake is my own business." He studied her for a long moment, the whetstone eyes moving over her face like he was reading something written there in ink she couldn't see herself. "You're angrier than you're frightened. Is that unusual?" "Yes." Pause. "It's also inconvenient. Frightened people are easier to manage." "I'll try to be less trouble," she said, dry as paper, and this time the almost smile lasted a full second before it vanished. He left her alone not long after, with a quiet instruction that food would be brought and that the bedroom door, unlike every other door in the suite, locked from the inside. She noted that too, filed it beside the absence of any raised hand, any leer, any of the violence she'd steeled herself for in the car. It didn't feel like safety. It felt like waiting for a blow that hadn't been decided on yet. Alone, finally, in a room larger than the whole of her old bedroom, she sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed and allowed herself, for the first time since the kitchen table, to shake, not from fear exactly, or not only fear, but from the sheer physical cost of holding herself so rigidly upright for so many hours. She did not cry. She pressed her ink-stained fingers to her sternum instead, the way she used to when her mother was dying, and breathed and told herself the same thing she'd told herself at 11 and at 15 and at every hard door since. "You are still here. That is not nothing." Outside the window, the rain kept falling over Mayfair, indifferent, endless, and somewhere beneath it London went on, not knowing that a girl with ink-stained fingers had just become the single most carefully guarded asset in a criminal empire she hadn't asked to enter. The questioning when it came wasn't what she expected either. She'd braced for threats. What she got, over the following 3 days, was something closer to an interview conducted by a man who already suspected he knew most of the answers and was simply confirming them for his own records. He came to the suite each afternoon, always at the same hour, always alone, and asked questions with the patience of someone who had nowhere else more urgent to be, though she doubted that was true. "Your father," he said the first day, seated across from her with a cup of tea he did not drink. "He worked the docks." "How do you know that?" "I make it my business to know what I'm acquiring." No apology in it. "Your mother?" "Dead. Cancer." "For years after him." She watched his face for the flicker of performed sympathy she'd learned to distrust in Derek and found none, only a kind of attention that felt, disorientingly, more respectful than sympathy would have been. "You draw," he said on the second day, and it wasn't a guess. Someone had clearly gone through her sketchbook, and the violation of it, the one object she'd carried out of that flat, opened by strangers' hands, made something in her go cold and tight. "You had no right." "No," he agreed evenly. "I didn't. I did it anyway. You should know that about me now rather than later." He slid the sketchbook back across the table, and she saw, with a jolt she didn't examine too closely, that every page was intact. Nothing torn out. Nothing damaged. The rooftops are good. The people less so, not because you lack skill. Because you don't let yourself get close enough to draw them properly. She said nothing to that because he was right, and being seen so precisely by a stranger who owned the roof over her head was its own particular kind of violence. On the third day he laid a single document on the table between them. A bank transfer, dated, the amount matching, almost to the pound, the figure Derek had wept over at the kitchen table for 2 years. Your stepfather's debt, Bitgaram said. Cleared. In full. As of this morning. So I'm paid for. You were never for sale, he said, and something in his voice, some minute shift in register, made her look up properly for the first time in 3 days. Derek Hale sold what he had no right to sell. I've simply ensured no one else in this city makes the same mistake about you twice. She didn't understand, not fully, until the fourth document appeared. Not a bill of sale, nothing so crude, but a formal notice of protection, her name written into it in a hand she didn't recognize, sealed with something that functioned, in the world he moved through, like a decree. What is this? Insurance, he said. In my world, debts get inherited unless someone with enough weight says otherwise. As of tonight, you are under my protection. Publicly. Absolutely. Anyone who touches you touches me, and very few people in this city are foolish enough to want that. And if I don't want your protection? For the first time, something that might have been the ghost of respect crossed his face. Then you may tell me so and I'll arrange something else. But I'd ask you to consider, Miss Clarke, what something else looked like for you before tonight. He nodded once toward the document. Your signature makes it formal. Nothing more is required of you. She signed. Not because she trusted him, she didn't, not yet, not for a long time, but because for the first time in 6 years, someone was offering her a wall instead of asking her to be one, and Estille Clarke had learned, the hard way, to recognize the difference between a cage and a shield even when they were built from the same stone. The warehouse loft by the Thames was nothing like the Mayfair suite. Raw brick, high windows, the river's cold breath audible even through glass, cranes and gulls visible from the kitchen in the mornings. It felt oddly more honest. Bitgaram moved through it the way he moved through everything, without wasted motion, and told her only that it was safer, that the suite had been for show and this was for living. The public claiming happened 3 days after the move, at a private club in a part of Mayfair she hadn't known existed, all low lighting and quieter danger than any bar in East London had ever contained. Bitgaram introduced her to no one directly. Instead he stood beside her long enough, close enough, still enough, that every man in the room understood without being told. She felt the weight of that attention like a physical thing, not comfortable exactly but oddly steadying, the way standing beside a wall steadies you even when you didn't choose the wall. The test came a week later. A man, minor she gathered afterward, some low rung of a rival operation, cornered her near the loading entrance while she was fetching something from the car, hand closing hard around her wrist before she'd even registered the danger, muttering something about Bitgaram's little charity case and what she might be worth to someone willing to test the new arrangement. She didn't scream. 6 years of small survivals had taught her that screaming rarely helped and always cost something. She twisted, hard, the way she'd once read about in a self-defense pamphlet at 16, and it bought her exactly the half-second she needed for CO, Bitgaram's lieutenant, quiet and terrifyingly fast, who'd apparently been watching from a doorway she hadn't clocked, to close the distance and put the man on the concrete with an efficiency that had nothing showy in it at all. Bitgaram arrived 4 minutes later. She would remember always the particular quality of his stillness in that moment, not the loud fury she might have expected, but something colder and more absolute, a stillness with a decision already made inside it. He said almost nothing to the man on the ground. He said even less to her beyond a single question. Are you hurt? Asked in a voice so carefully controlled it frightened her more than shouting would have. She learned what happened to the man 3 days later, second-hand, from CO, who delivered the information without relish, simply as fact. 2 fingers surgically precise, a message sent to whichever crew had sent him that Estille Clarke was not an opening to be tested twice. She sat with that knowledge for a long time afterward, turning it over the way she turned over everything, and found in herself a reaction that unsettled her more than the violence itself. Not horror, though horror was in there somewhere, but a threat of something closer to relief, and beneath the relief, guilt at feeling it. You didn't have to tell me, she said to Bitgaram that evening, finding him at the window with a glass he wasn't drinking from, watching the crane's red lights blink over the black river. You'd have found out. Pause. And I don't lie to you. That was the rule. Does it bother you? What you had done to him? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. It should, more than it does, he said finally, not looking at her. That's not something I say often. Consider it kept between us. It was, she thought later, lying awake and listening to the river move beneath the windows, the first true thing he'd given her that wasn't a rule or a wall. A small, private admission of his own cost. She did not know yet what to do with it, only that she found herself unwillingly wanting more of them. Winter settled properly over the Thames, and with it came a rhythm Estille hadn't expected to find inside a life she still, technically, hadn't chosen. Bitgaram arranged, without asking her opinion on the matter first and then, seeing her face actually asking, remote illustration studies through a small atelier in Bermondsey, proper tuition, proper materials, the first formal instruction she'd ever had. She resented briefly that he'd assumed rather than offered. She softened, more slowly, watching how carefully he backed away from every decision the moment she pushed back on it, as though testing, always testing, where the line between protection and ownership actually sat for her, and adjusting himself to stay on the right side of it. She learned his world in fragments, the way you learn a language by immersion rather than instruction. She learned that CO, quiet and economical with words, had a dry humor that only surfaced around 2 a.m. when the loft was otherwise silent. She learned which visitors came through the freight lift rather than the front, and what that distinction meant. She learned to recognize the particular quality of tension in Bitgaram's shoulders that meant a night was going to end badly for someone who wasn't her, and over weeks she stopped flinching from it and started simply watching. Cataloging. The habit of a lifetime, turned now toward understanding rather than survival alone. The night he came home with blood on his knuckles, not his own, she gathered from the careful way he flexed his hand, she was still awake, sketchbook open on the kitchen counter, drawing the river lights through the tall windows. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and for a moment something unguarded crossed his face, quickly smoothed away. You should be asleep. You should wash your hands before you say that to me like it's the strange part of tonight, she said and watched, with something like satisfaction, the corner of his mouth twitch again, the same almost smile from the first night, more familiar now, less rare. He washed his hands. He came and stood near the counter, not too close, careful the way he was always careful, and looked at the sketch under her hand. The cranes, the black water, a single gull caught mid-flight against the sodium light. You've started drawing the water, he observed. You didn't before. I didn't have a river to look at before. She didn't look up from the page. Only rooftops. You get used to looking at what's in front of you. He was quiet for a while, watching the pencil move. In Busan, he said eventually, so evenly she almost missed that it was an offering, there was a harbor like this. Different light. Same water, more or less, if you follow it far enough. It was the first time he'd volunteered anything about himself unprompted. She kept her eyes on the page, sensing correctly that looking up too quickly would close the door he'd just opened a crack. Does it feel far away? She asked carefully. Busan. Some days, he said. Some days it feels like the only real place I've ever been. He didn't elaborate further and she didn't push, but something had shifted in the room's quiet. A small unlocking, mutual, unspoken, and when she finally looked up, he was watching her the way she'd once watched London's rooftops, like something worth the trouble of getting close enough to draw properly. Derek found a way back into her life the way weak men usually do, sideways, through fear rather than courage, 3 months after the flat had gone silent behind her. The message came through CO, forwarded with visible distaste. Derek had approached one of Bitgaram's rivals, quietly, clumsily, offering information about the household in exchange for a debt of his own being forgiven. Information about Estille. About the loft's layout, its schedule, the small domestic details a frightened man might have gleaned in 6 years of half-attention and was now willing to trade for his own comfort. Estille felt the news land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water, not surprise exactly. She'd never mistaken Derek's cowardice for a fixed quantity. She'd simply hoped, foolishly, that distance might have improved him rather than merely giving him room to be afraid of someone new. Bitgaram's response was immediate and entirely without theater. The flat was sold within the week, not seized she learned but bought outright at a price generous enough that no court could later call it coercion, which told her he'd thought several moves ahead of anything Derek might attempt in retaliation. Kelsey and Ryan were encouraged, through channels she never fully understood and didn't ask to relocate outside London entirely. Derek received a single visit from CO, the content of which was never repeated to her, and a document, delivered directly into Estille's hands, not his, formally severing any remaining legal or financial tie between the Hale family and herself. She read it twice, sitting at the kitchen counter with the river gray and restless beyond the windows, and found to her own surprise that she felt less triumph than a kind of quiet, aching relief. the specific grief of watching a door close on a room you'd spent years wishing you could leave and now simply mourned for what it had never been. That evening at the private club where he'd first claimed her publicly, she asked him the question she'd been circling for weeks. Why do this? All of it. The house, the severance, she gestured, encompassing months of careful, absolute protection. You cleared a debt. You didn't have to become my wall against an entire family. Bitgaram was quiet long enough that she thought, again, he might not answer. When he did, his voice had none of its usual careful flatness. Because I know what it is, he said, to be treated as currency by people who were supposed to protect you. I was young once and worth exactly what someone else decided I was worth, and no one built a wall for me. A pause, his jaw tight. I built my own, eventually. Out of the only material I trust, which is power, and I have spent a great many years making sure no one could ever again decide my worth for me. He looked at her directly then, whetstone eyes steady. You reminded me what it costs to go without a wall. I couldn't watch that happen twice in the same city and do nothing. That's not really an answer about me, she said quietly. That's an answer about you. Perhaps, he allowed. Ask me again in the spring. I may have a better one by then. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't nothing either. Winter deepened around the loft, and with it, his visits lengthened, not longer in duration exactly but longer in what they contained. He began arriving before dinner rather than after. He began, on quieter nights, telling her fragments of Busan, a harbor, a mother he rarely mentioned by name, a version of himself at 19 who had been, by his own flat, unsentimental account, given a choice between being currency or becoming the kind of man no one could spend without consequence. I chose the second thing, he told her one night, the two of them seated at opposite ends of the long kitchen table with tea neither of them was drinking, and I have never, not once, regretted the choosing. But I've regretted, some nights, what it made me stop being able to feel. What did it make you stop feeling? Surprise, he said after a moment. Softness without immediately distrusting it. His eyes found hers, steady, and something in his voice thinned, went almost unguarded. You are the first surprise I've had in a very long time, Estille Clarke. She sat with that for a long moment, turning it the way she turned everything, carefully, honestly, refusing to let herself either dismiss it or inflate it into more than it was. I don't know what I feel, she admitted finally, because he had never lied to her and she found now that she didn't want to lie to him either. Grateful. Angry, sometimes that gratitude is even part of it. Something else, underneath both, that I haven't let myself name yet. You don't have to name it, he said. I'd rather you were honest about not knowing than certain about a lie. It was, she thought, the most tender thing anyone had said to her in 6 years, delivered in the flattest possible voice, by a man the whole of London's underworld called the Black Lotus and crossed streets to avoid. She found herself, in the quiet that followed, reaching across the table, not far, not dramatically, just far enough to rest her ink-stained fingers briefly against the back of his hand, the first time she touched him without either fear or necessity behind it. He went very still. Not the dangerous stillness she'd learned to read in his shoulders before violence. A different stillness, careful, almost disbelieving, a man unused to being touched gently and unsure, for one unguarded moment, what to do with it. I'm not payment anymore, she said quietly. Am I? You were never payment, he said low. You've simply taken this long to believe me. Neither of them moved the hand away. The threat arrived the way threats in his world usually did, sideways through weakness rather than direct confrontation. A rival crew, sensing the particular vulnerability of a man who had made his attachment to one woman publicly, unmistakably clear, attempted to use her as leverage. A photograph taken from too far away to be flattering and too close to be accidental, sent not to Bitgaram directly but leaked toward journalists circling the edges of London's underworld, threatening exposure that would strip away the anonymity keeping her safe in the first place. Bitgaram's response, when it came, was cold, fast, and entirely without hesitation. He was gone for 3 days, the longest absence since she'd arrived, and in that time the loft filled with a different kind of silence, watchful, armed, a constant quiet presence at the door with instructions Estille understood without needing them spelled out. She kept a blade had given her, without ceremony, on the counter within reach, and found herself, for the first time since the kitchen table with Derek, genuinely uncertain whether the next knock at the door would be safety or its opposite. She did not fall apart. She drew instead, furiously, for hours, filling page after page with the river and the cranes and once, unable to stop herself, the particular set of Bitgaram's shoulders from memory, the stillness that meant a decision had already been made. He returned on the third night, rain-soaked, exhausted in a way she'd never seen in him, and said only, "It's finished," before crossing the room and for the first time, simply sitting beside her rather than across from her, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, close enough that she could feel him breathing. "You don't have to tell me what finished means," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "But I want you to know the threat is gone. Completely. No one will attempt that again." She turned to look at him properly then, the exhaustion in his face, the rare, careful vulnerability of a man who had spent 3 days making himself into a weapon on her behalf and had come home wanting, for once, not to be feared but simply to sit beside someone who understood the cost of it. "This can't just be protection anymore," she said. "Can it? Whatever this is." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the river through the window rather than her face, as though the admission required somewhere else to look. "No," he said finally. "I don't think it can. I think we're going to have to decide soon what it actually is instead." It wasn't relief she felt hearing that. It was something more frightening and more honest than relief, the recognition that a door she hadn't let herself fully approach was standing open now, and that she would have to choose deliberately whether to walk through it. Spring came to the Thames the way it always did, reluctantly, in increments, gray mornings slowly gaining a little gold at the edges. The loft had stopped feeling like a cage months ago, though Estille couldn't have named the exact day it happened, only that somewhere between the sketchbooks filling with river light and the quiet nights at the long kitchen table, it had become, simply and undramatically, home. Bitgaram found her on the rooftop one evening in April, sketchbook forgotten in her lap, watching the light change over water that had carried, by now, an entire winter of her attention. He didn't sit immediately. He stood at the railing beside her, the city's low hum rising distant and indifferent below them, and for a while neither of them spoke, because by now they had both learned that silence between them was rarely empty. "I want to give you a real choice," he said finally without preamble, because he had never been a man for preamble. Not the illusion of one. A real one. He turned to face her fully. "You can leave. Tonight if you want it. Money, safety, a life anywhere you choose, no obligation to me at all. Or you can stay under the old terms, protected, provided for, nothing more asked of you than what's already true. Or," and here, for the first time in the whole of their strange history, she heard something in his voice that might have been nerves, "you can stay as something chosen. Not payment. Not a debt cleared. Something I am asking for, honestly, and will understand completely if you refuse." Estille closed the sketchbook slowly, giving herself the small ritual of the movement to steady what she felt rising in her chest. She thought of the kitchen table in East London, the fluorescent light, Derek's wet, useless eyes. She thought of the black Audi in the rain, the underground garage, the first sight of him in that pale stone hallway, the terrifying stillness she had since learned to read as its own kind of language. She thought of ink-stained fingers on the back of his hand, and blood washed carefully from his knuckles before he'd let himself speak to her. "And you were never payment. You've simply taken this long to believe me. I spent 6 years being told, in 100 small ways, that I was worth exactly as much as I was useful," she said quietly. "I don't want to build whatever this is on the same foundation. If I stay it has to be because I choose it. Not because I don't know how to leave." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm asking instead of assuming." She looked out at the river, the light softening toward evening, the city that had taken almost everything from her and then, through the strangest possible door, given her back something she hadn't known she was still capable of wanting. "Then I'm choosing," she said, and found saying it, that her voice didn't shake at all. "Not the shield. Not the debt. Whatever that turns out to mean, whatever it costs either of us to find out." He didn't smile the way people smiled in the films she used to half-watch on nights when the flat felt too loud to bear. He simply reached over, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and closed his hand gently around hers, ink-stained fingers against a palm that had done violence and precision in equal measure, both of them carrying the particular weight of people who had survived being currency and come out the other side determined never to be spent again. "Untouchable," he said quietly, testing the word the way she'd once tested his name in that first stone hallway. "That's what I promised you the first night. You kept it," she said. "Better than I believed you would." Below them, the Thames moved on toward the sea the way it always had, indifferent and eternal, carrying the whole gray, hard-won history of the city with it. Estille Clarke sat on a rooftop in April light beside a man the world called Ruthless, holding a hand that had learned, slowly, carefully, to be gentle only with her, and understood, clear-eyed, unsentimental, entirely her own woman even now, that she had not been rescued. She had simply, finally, chosen her own wall and decided, with everything she had left after 6 years of learning how to survive, to build something real behind it. The future stayed open ahead of them, unwritten, uncertain in all the ordinary human ways that love is always uncertain. But for the first time since her father's death in a Grey Tuesday kitchen a lifetime ago, Estille did not feel like something waiting to be spent. She felt at long last like someone worth keeping.